The morning air was crisp as Joe Rogan pulled into the parking lot of his studio. Today wasn't just another day of recording. Today was the day Keanu Reeves would be sitting across from him, something he'd been trying to arrange for nearly 3 years. Joe sipped his black coffee, staring at the brick building that housed his recording studio. His stomach fluttered with a feeling he rarely experienced anymore: genuine nervousness. After thousands of interviews with everyone from scientists to fighters to movie stars, very few guests made him feel this way. "You're here early," said Jamie, his producer, unlocking the front door. Jamie knew how much this interview meant to Joe. They'd been discussing it for weeks. "Couldn't sleep," Joe admitted. "Been up since 4 reading through my notes again." Jamie smiled knowingly. "The Keanu effect. Even you're not immune." Inside, Joe settled at his desk, spreading out pages of research. Unlike many hosts who relied on pre-written questions or a team to brief them, Joe believed in doing the deep work himself. His desk was covered with printouts, interviews Keanu had given over the decades, reviews of his films, articles about his charity work, and notes about the personal tragedies that had shaped his life but that he rarely discussed. Joe picked up a pen, circling key points he wanted to touch on: the motorcycle collection, the bass guitar playing, the training regimen for John Wick. But these were just entry points. What he really wanted was to get to the person behind the persona, the thinking man beneath the action star. "You want the usual setup?" Jamie asked, adjusting microphones. Joe shook his head. "Let's change things a bit. Move the chairs so they're at more of an angle, less confrontational. And dim the overhead lights. Let's use the lamps instead. Make it feel less like an interview, more like a conversation." As Jamie rearranged the furniture, Joe walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot that would soon hold Keanu's motorcycle. He thought about the first time he'd seen Keanu on screen decades ago. Even then, there had been something different about him. A stillness, a thoughtfulness that set him apart from other actors his age. "You never get this worked up over guests," Jamie observed, testing the sound levels. "What is it about this one?" Joe turned from the window. "He's seen things, man. Been through hell and come out the other side still kind. Still genuine. In an industry that chews people up, he's remained human. Unlike some of the jerks we've had in here." Jamie laughed. "Exactly." Joe nodded. "Plus, he never does long-form interviews like this. 3, maybe 4 hours of uninterrupted conversation. No publicist cutting him off, no predetermined talking points. Just wherever the conversation takes us." Joe's phone buzzed, a text from his assistant letting him know Keanu's team had confirmed he was en route. In just over an hour, the man himself would be walking through that door. "I'm going to meditate for 20 minutes, Joe told Jamie. "Then let's do final sound checks." In his small office, Joe sat cross-legged on the floor, closing his eyes. His mind was racing too much for proper meditation, instead filling with questions he wanted to ask. About grief and how to carry it. About fame and its emptiness. About finding meaning in a world that often seemed designed to strip it away. These were questions Joe asked himself often. Questions he'd explored with therapists, with trusted friends, in the solitude of float tanks, and through various plant medicines over the years. But he'd never found complete answers. Something told him Keanu might have insights worth hearing. After 15 minutes of this not-quite meditation, Joe gave up and returned to the main room where his technical team had now arrived. They moved efficiently around the space, checking cameras and lighting, the well-oiled machine of a production that reached millions. "We've got the green tea he likes," one of the assistants told Joe. "And bottled water. No snacks, though. His team said he just ate." Joe nodded, pacing now. "How's the outside looking? Any fans figured out he's coming?" "All clear so far," Jamie assured him. "Security's on it. We've kept this one quiet." Keeping guests a secret until the episode aired was becoming harder. With social media and the growing popularity of the podcast, fans often staked out the parking lot, hoping to spot visitors. For some guests, that attention was fine. For someone like Keanu, who valued his privacy, Joe had taken extra precautions. 10 minutes out, Jamie announced, reading a text. They just turned onto the main road. Joe stopped pacing and took a deep breath. Okay, I'm going to use the bathroom one more time and then I'll wait by the door. No big welcome committee, just me. In the bathroom, Joe splashed cold water on his face and looked at himself in the mirror. At his age, he'd learned a few things about people. The biggest was that you could never truly know someone from their public persona. He'd had guests he'd expected to love who turned out to be disappointments, entitled, closed off, or just plain boring once the cameras were rolling. And he'd had guests he'd been unsure about who turned out to be fascinating, kind, and genuine. With Keanu, though, every story from those who knew him pointed in the same direction. The random acts of kindness, the way he treated film crews, the humble lifestyle despite his wealth, the patience with fans. If even half of it was true, this was someone worth talking to. A knock on the bathroom door interrupted his thoughts. They're pulling up, Jamie called. Joe dried his hands and walked to the front entrance. Through the glass, he saw a motorcycle pulling into a parking spot. Not a flashy bike, but a classic Harley-Davidson. The rider, dressed in a black jacket and jeans, removed his helmet. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking Keanu Reeves. Joe watched as Keanu exchanged a few words with the security guard, then laughed at something the man said. Not the forced laugh of a celebrity tolerating staff, but a genuine moment of connection. Already, Joe felt his nervousness being replaced with anticipation. He opened the door as Keanu approached, helmet under one arm. They shook hands. Keanu's grip firm but not aggressive. Thanks for making the time, Joe said. Thanks for having me, Keanu replied, his voice exactly as it sounded in films, but somehow more present. Nice place. Joe led him inside, giving him the quick tour that all guests received. What struck Joe immediately was how attentive Keanu was, asking the names of each crew member, making eye contact, showing genuine interest in the equipment and setup. Many celebrities walked through these same doors with an air of doing everyone a favor by their presence. Keanu carried himself like a guest grateful for the invitation. Now we've got about 20 minutes before we start recording, Joe explained as they reached the main studio area. Anything you need? Water, bathroom, time to collect your thoughts? I'm good, Keanu said, settling into one of the chairs and looking around the room with interest. I listened to your conversation with that quantum physicist last week. Fascinating stuff about multiple dimensions. Joe raised his eyebrows, surprised. You're a listener? When I'm in the workshop, working on bike designs, your show makes the hours fly by. Keanu leaned forward slightly. I particularly liked the one with the sleep expert. Changed how I think about my own insomnia. This was not how Joe had expected the conversation to begin, with Keanu revealing he was familiar with the show. It shifted something in the dynamic, made it feel less like host and subject and more like two people with shared interests. As the crew finished their preparations, Joe and Keanu continued talking, discovering other points of connection. Martial arts training, a fascination with consciousness, even some mutual acquaintances in the film world. By the time Jamie gave the 5-minute warning, the initial nervousness Joe had felt had transformed into the excited energy he got before conversations he knew would be special. We usually go about 3 hours, Joe explained, but there's no hard stop. We can go longer if the conversation is flowing. I cleared my schedule for the day, Keanu replied with a small smile. I'm in your hands. Jamie counted them down, and the red recording light illuminated. As Joe looked at Keanu across the table, he had the sense that despite all his preparation, he was about to experience something unexpected, a conversation that might go places neither of them had planned. And we're live, Joe said, leaning toward his microphone. Today's guest needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. The conversation that would change both men had begun. The red light on the camera glowed steadily as Joe settled into his chair, feeling the familiar rush that came with going live. Across from him sat Keanu Reeves, relaxed yet attentive, his posture open and engaged. The nervousness Joe had felt earlier had transformed into a different kind of energy. the heightened awareness that came when a conversation promised to be something special. "So," Joe began, leaning slightly forward, "I've wanted to have you on for years. I think we have a lot of overlapping interests, martial arts, motorcycles, big questions about life. Where should we start?" Keanu smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "Wherever you want, man. I'm just happy to be here." There was something disarming about his sincerity. In an industry built on carefully crafted personas, Keanu's lack of pretense was immediately noticeable. "Let's start with the bikes," Joe said. "I saw you rode in on a Harley, beautiful machine." Keanu's face lit up. "She's a 2018 FXBR Fat Bob. Not the most expensive bike I own, but there's something about the way she handles. The balance is perfect." And just like that, they were off. What began as a conversation about motorcycles flowed naturally into stories about road trips, close calls, and the meditative quality of long rides. Joe watched as Keanu used his hands to describe the perfect curve of a mountain road, his entire body engaged in the telling. "There's this stretch on the Pacific Coast Highway," Keanu was saying, "just after sunrise when the fog is still lifting off the water. No one else on the road. Just you and the machine and the ocean. It's about as close to perfect as life gets." Joe nodded. That feeling of being completely present. No past, no future. "Exactly," Keanu agreed. "It's like everything drops away, except the moment. No movies, no fame, no problems, just breathing and moving through space." Jamie, sitting quietly at his control station, gave Joe a subtle thumbs up. The chemistry was undeniable. The conversation flowed like they were old friends catching up rather than two people who'd just met. As they moved from motorcycles to martial arts, Joe was struck by Keanu's humility. Despite years of intensive training for various films, he spoke of himself as a perpetual student rather than a master. "The teachers I worked with for The Matrix, for John Wick, these people dedicated their lives to perfecting these arts," Keanu explained. "I just get to borrow a little of their knowledge. The real mastery belongs to them." Joe leaned back in his chair. "But you put in the work, man. I've heard stories about your training regimen for John Wick. 12 hours a day, gun work, judo, jiu-jitsu. That's commitment beyond what most actors would give." Keanu shrugged, seeming almost embarrassed by the praise. "It's respect for the craft, for the audience. If someone's paying to see you play a character who's supposed to be the best at something, you owe them your best attempt at that." He paused, then added with a half-smile, "Plus, it's fun. How many people get paid to learn how to throw knives or drift cars?" This modesty wasn't an act. Joe had interviewed enough celebrities to recognize genuine from performative humility. With Keanu, there seemed to be no separation between the person and the presentation. 2 hours into the conversation, they'd covered territory from film production to philosophy, from classic literature to comic books. Each topic revealed new facets of Keanu's personality, his thoughtfulness, his wide-ranging interests, his unexpected humor. During a brief pause while they both sipped water, Joe glanced at his notes. He'd barely looked at them since they started. The conversation had taken its own path, more engaging than anything he could have planned. "You know," Joe said, setting down his glass, "we've been talking for a while now and we haven't even touched on your new project. Your publicist will probably be mad at me." Keanu laughed, a genuine burst of amusement. "Nah, she knows how these things go. Besides, this is more interesting than the usual press tour questions, which are, oh, you know, how did you prepare for the role? What was it like working with so-and-so? Would you do a sequel?" He shrugged. "The same questions. In every interview, just phrased slightly differently." "And you've been doing this for what, almost 40 years now?" Joe asked. "Since I was 17, Keanu confirmed. "It's been a long, strange trip." "What keeps you going?" Joe asked. "A lot of people in your position, they'd have burned out by now, or become jaded, or disappeared to a private island somewhere." Keanu thought for a moment, his expression growing more contemplative. "The work itself, I guess. When it's good. When you're part of creating something that moves people or makes them think or just gives them a few hours of joy, that's worth all the other stuff." The other stuff being the fame, the lack of privacy, all that? Yeah. Keanu shifted in his chair. It's a strange thing being known by people you don't know, being watched, having your words and actions picked apart. He smiled slightly. I'm grateful for it, though. It's allowed me to do work I care about, to support causes that matter to me. Joe nodded, recognizing the careful balance Keanu was striking, acknowledging the difficulties of fame without sounding ungrateful. It was a line many celebrities failed to walk successfully. You mentioned causes, Joe said. You've done a lot of charity work over the years, but you don't talk about it much. A slight discomfort crossed Keanu's face. It feels, I don't know, wrong to publicize it like it becomes about me rather than the people being helped. I respect that, Joe said. Too many people doing good just for the Instagram moment. Exactly. Keanu leaned forward, growing more animated. True generosity has no audience, right? It's between you and whoever you're helping. The moment it becomes a performance, something changes. Joe felt a shift in the energy of the conversation. They were moving into deeper waters now. He glanced at the clock. Nearly 3 hours had passed, but neither of them showed any signs of fatigue. If anything, the discussion was becoming more engaged, more real. Jamie silently placed fresh water glasses on the table and retreated. The small studio felt increasingly intimate, as if the rest of the world was falling away, leaving just two people exploring ideas together. You've lived such an unusual life, Joe said after a pause. Fame at a young age, massive success, but also some profound losses. How has that shaped your view of the world? Something subtle changed in Keanu's expression. Not closing off exactly, but a shift to a more thoughtful, internal place. He didn't answer immediately, and Joe didn't rush him. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with consideration. I think, Keanu began slowly, choosing his words with care. I think the extremes teach you that nothing is permanent. Success, failure, happiness, pain, they all come and go. He looked directly at Joe. The trick is not getting too attached to either state. Not clinging to the good moments or pushing away the difficult ones. Joe nodded, recognizing echoes of Buddhist philosophy in Keanu's words. That's hard to do, though, as humans we're wired to cling to pleasure and avoid pain. Absolutely, Keanu agreed. I'm not saying I've mastered it. Far from it. He smiled ruefully. But it's a practice, right? A daily choice to try to stay present with whatever is happening, without judgment. Do you meditate? Joe asked. Not formally. But there are activities that put me in that state. Riding, certain kinds of physical training, sometimes when I'm reading or playing bass. Times, when the constant chatter in my head quiets down. Joe understood exactly what he meant. Flow state, when you're so absorbed in something that your sense of self disappears. Yes, Keanu's face brightened with the pleasure of being understood. Those moments of flow. They're like little windows into a different way of being. More immediate, more real somehow. As they continued exploring these ideas, Joe became increasingly aware that this conversation had moved beyond the typical celebrity interview. They weren't just exchanging words, but genuinely connecting around shared interests and questions. The technical crew, who had heard thousands of interviews over the years, were unusually still and attentive. Even Jamie, typically focused on his equipment, was listening intently. We're coming up on 4 hours, Joe mentioned eventually. Should we wrap it up or do you want to keep going? Keanu glanced at his watch, seeming surprised by how much time had passed. I'm good to continue if you are, unless you have somewhere else to be. Nowhere I'd rather be than right here having this conversation, Joe said with complete honesty. Keanu smiled. Then let's keep going. I'm enjoying this. Joe felt a surge of satisfaction. In a world of carefully managed celebrity appearances and 15-minute promotional interviews, there was something refreshingly genuine about this exchange. Whatever happened next, he knew this episode would stand apart from the hundreds that had come before. In that case, Joe said, leaning forward slightly, there's something I've been wanting to ask you for years. Joe took a long sip of water, gathering his thoughts. The conversation with Keanu had already gone deeper than most of his interviews, touching on life philosophy, the nature of fame, and finding meaning in a chaotic world. But there was something else he wanted to explore, a question that had been on his mind since long before Keanu walked through the studio door. "You know," Joe began, setting down his glass. "We've been talking for hours now, and I feel like we've covered so much ground." Keanu nodded, fully present in the moment. The easy rapport they'd established had only deepened as the conversation progressed. "But there's something I've wanted to ask you for years. Something I've thought about whenever I've seen your work or read interviews with you." Joe paused, suddenly aware of the weight of the moment. "It's a bit more personal, though. Feel free to tell me if it's territory you don't want to get into. Ask away," Keanu said, his expression open. "Worst I can do is say I'd rather not answer." Joe leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "You've lived a life that's hard for most people to even imagine. Extraordinary success, adoration from millions, but also profound loss and grief that played out in the public eye. You've experienced the highest highs and lowest lows a human can face." Keanu's expression remained attentive, but something shifted in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth in Joe's words. "What I want to ask is this," Joe continued, his voice dropping slightly. "After everything you've been through, all the success, the losses, the love and the pain, what do you think is the point of it all? What makes life worth living when you've seen both the best and worst it has to offer?" The studio fell completely silent. Jamie, who had been quietly managing the equipment, went completely still. Even the usual subtle movements of the camera operators ceased. It was as if everyone in the room collectively held their breath, waiting. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, then out toward the window where afternoon light filtered through. The pause wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the natural space needed for such a question. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but clear. "That's not a small question," he said with a slight smile. "No," Joe agreed. "It's not. The easy answer would be to say I don't know," Keanu continued. "And part of me doesn't. I don't think anyone fully does." He shifted in his chair, gathering his thoughts. "But I have glimpses, moments of clarity that come and go." Joe nodded, giving him space to continue. "When I was younger," Keanu said, "I thought the point was achievement. Making great films, being recognized for your work, creating something that lasts." His eyes met Joe's. "And there is joy in creation, in putting something beautiful or meaningful into the world that wasn't there before." "But that changed?" Joe prompted gently. "It expanded," Keanu corrected. "Life has a way of reshuffling your priorities." The unspoken reference to his personal tragedies hung in the air. Joe knew the outline of Keanu's story: the loss of his daughter who was stillborn, the death of his former partner in a car accident shortly after, events that would shatter anyone's world. "When you face real loss," Keanu continued carefully, "all the things you thought were important start to look different. Awards, money, fame, they still have their place, but they're not the core of what matters." "What is?" Joe asked. "The core, I mean." Keanu took a deep breath. "Connection," he said simply. "The moments of genuine connection with other people. The times when the walls come down and you're truly present with someone else." He gestured between them. "Like this conversation. There's something real happening here. An authentic exchange. That's rare and valuable." Joe nodded, feeling the truth of it. Despite having talked with thousands of people on his podcast, there were only a handful of conversations that had this quality, a genuine meeting of minds without performance or agenda. "I've come to believe," Keanu continued, "that those connections, whether they're with friends or family or sometimes even strangers, are what make the journey worthwhile. Everything else is just decoration." "Even the work?" Joe asked, knowing how central acting and filmmaking were to Keanu's life. The work is important, Keanu acknowledged, but its real value for me anyway is in the connections it creates, the collaborations with other artists, the moments when something you helped make touches someone else's life in a meaningful way. He smiled slightly. I get letters sometimes, from people who say a film I was in helped them through a dark time, or made them see something differently, or just gave them a few hours of joy when they needed it. That's not about me. It's about connection. The film was just the bridge. As Keanu spoke, Joe was struck by his lack of pretense. There was no hint of rehearsed wisdom or performative depth, just a man sharing honestly what he'd come to believe through his own experiences. There's something else too, Keanu added after a moment. Something I've been thinking about more in recent years. What's that? Joe asked. Kindness, Keanu said. Simple human kindness. His eyes took on a distant quality, as if looking beyond the room. We're all struggling in our own ways, all carrying burdens others can't see. The older I get, the more I think that small acts of kindness might be the most important thing we do with our time here. He looked slightly embarrassed, as if worried he sounded preachy. Not that I've mastered this, far from it, but I've been on the receiving end of kindness when I needed it most. Moments where someone's small act of compassion kept me going when I might have given up. Like what? Joe asked, genuinely curious. Keanu hesitated, clearly weighing how personal to get. After I lost someone very important to me, he said carefully, there was a period where I was lost, functioning on the outside, but hollow inside. His voice remained steady, but Joe could see the emotional weight behind his words. I was in a grocery store just going through the motions of normal life. Must have looked as bad as I felt because an elderly cashier, someone I'd never met before, took my hand when she gave me my change, just held it for a moment and said, "It won't feel like this forever, son." Keanu shook his head slightly, the memory still vivid. Such a small thing, 5 seconds of her day, but it was like a tiny crack in the darkness, a reminder that I was still connected to the world even when I felt completely alone. Joe nodded, understanding. Those moments stay with you. They do, Keanu agreed, and they've made me think that maybe the point of it all is simpler than we make it. Maybe it's about easing each other's journey however we can, being witnesses to each other's lives, saying, I see you, you matter, you're not alone. The studio remained completely silent. Even the usual ambient noises of equipment humming seemed to have faded away. It was as if the space itself was holding the weight of the conversation. So if I had to answer your question, Keanu continued, his voice gaining certainty, I'd say the point is connection, and kindness, and finding beauty in the time we have, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. He met Joe's gaze directly. Because the pain is part of it too, right? The losses and failures and heartbreaks, they're not interruptions of the journey. They are the journey just as much as the joy and success. Joe nodded slowly, absorbing Keanu's words. In his years of conversations with countless people, scientists, philosophers, spiritual teachers, he'd rarely heard something that rang so true. That makes sense to me, Joe said quietly. More sense than a lot of the answers I've heard. Keanu smiled, the tension of the moment easing slightly. It's just my perspective, still evolving, still changing as I go. That's what makes it real, Joe replied. The willingness to keep questioning, keep evolving. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the conversation having reached a natural plateau. Joe glanced at Jamie, who was watching with unusual intensity, clearly moved by what he'd heard. Should we take a quick break? Joe asked, aware they'd been talking for over 4 hours. Keanu nodded, stretching slightly in his chair. Sounds good. As Jamie signaled that they were pausing the recording, Joe remained where he was, still processing what had just happened. In that moment, he knew this conversation would stay with him long after Keanu left the studio. Some interviews were just content, entertaining or informative, but ultimately forgettable. Others changed something in you. This, he realized, would be one of the latter. The red light on the camera blinked back to life as Joe and Keanu settled in after their short break. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of the studio, a deepening of the connection between them, a sense that they were no longer just host and guest, but two people engaged in a genuine exchange. "We're back," Joe said, his voice slightly different than before, more subdued, more thoughtful. "For those just tuning in, I'm sitting here with Keanu Reeves, and we've been having one of the most interesting conversations I've had in this studio." Keanu smiled slightly, seeming both at ease and fully present. "Before the break," Joe continued, "we were talking about what gives life meaning, especially after experiencing both the highest highs and lowest lows." He leaned forward. "You mentioned connection and kindness as being at the core of what matters. I'd like to dig deeper into that if you're willing." Keanu nodded. "Sure." "When did you come to that understanding?" Joe asked. "Was there a specific moment when your perspective shifted, or was it more gradual?" Keanu took a moment considering the question. When he spoke, his words were measured, as if he was discovering the answer as he went along. "There wasn't a single moment," he said. "More like a series of experiences that gradually reshuffled what I thought was important." He paused. "But there was a period that changed me more than others." Joe waited, giving him space to continue. "My 30s, Keanu said carefully. "I lost several people who were very important to me in a relatively short span of time. My best friend, River Phoenix. My sister was battling leukemia. And then—" He hesitated, the weight of memory visible in his expression. Joe nodded, knowing the losses Keanu was referring to but not pushing him to articulate them. "During that time," Keanu continued, "I learned something about grief that no one had ever told me. Everyone talks about the pain of loss, and that's real. It's enormous. But they don't tell you about the disorientation." "Disorientation?" Joe asked. "When your world is shattered," Keanu explained, "it's not just painful, it's disorienting. The map you've been using to navigate life suddenly doesn't work anymore. All the things you thought were solid and reliable reveal themselves to be temporary, fragile." As he spoke, his hands moved slightly, as if trying to shape the invisible concepts he was describing. "For a while I was lost, going through the motions of life, making movies, showing up for work, but without any real sense of purpose or meaning. Just existing." His eyes met Joe's. "You know that feeling?" "Yeah," Joe said quietly. "I do. The strange thing is," Keanu continued, "it was during that darkest period that I started to see something I hadn't noticed before. The small moments of connection with others, a conversation with a stranger, a kindness from a crew member on set, the way my sister would still laugh despite everything she was going through." He shook his head slightly, as if still surprised by the memory. These tiny points of light in the darkness, they weren't fixing anything. The losses were still there, the pain was still there, but they were lifelines. Reminders that I was still part of something larger than my own suffering. Joe nodded, completely engaged. "And that changed how you saw everything else?" "Eventually," Keanu said. "Not all at once, but over time I started to notice these connections more, to value them more. The awards, the box office numbers, the reviews, they still mattered for the work, but they stopped being how I measured the value of my life." "What became the measure instead?" Joe asked. Keanu thought for a moment. "The ability to be present, with myself, with others, to show up authentically without masks." He smiled slightly. "It sounds simple, but it's not easy." "No," Joe agreed. "It's probably the hardest thing there is. Especially in our line of work," Keanu added. "Entertainment, media. It's built around performance, around presenting a crafted image to the world. And that has its place. But there's a danger in starting to believe in your own performance." Joe leaned forward, struck by the insight. "You mean losing track of where the performance ends and the real person begins?" "Exactly," Keanu said, pointing slightly for emphasis. "I've seen it happen to people I care about. The line blurs. The performance takes over, and suddenly you're living as a character rather than a person. How have you avoided that? Joe asked, genuinely curious. You've been famous since you were practically a kid. That's gotta mess with your sense of self. Keanu's expression turned reflective. I've been lucky in some ways. I had friends who knew me before any of this happened, people who see me, not the image. That helps keep you grounded. He paused, considering further. And the losses, as painful as they were also clarifying. It's hard to get too caught up in Hollywood nonsense when you're facing real life and death. Joe nodded slowly. Perspective. Perspective, Keanu agreed. Though it's a hell of a way to get it. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the conversation settling around them. Jamie, still at his control panel, had given up any pretense of not being completely absorbed in the discussion. Can I ask you something else? Joe said finally. Something related, but maybe more practical? Go for it. How do you maintain that perspective in daily life? Because I struggle with this. It's easy to understand what matters when you're in a crisis or facing something profound. But then Monday morning comes and you're stuck in traffic and someone cuts you off and suddenly all that wisdom goes out the window. Keanu laughed, a genuine, warm sound. Oh man, I know exactly what you mean. 1 minute you're contemplating the meaning of existence, the next you're furious because the coffee shop got your order wrong. The moment of lightness felt perfectly timed, releasing some of the emotional intensity that had built up. I don't always maintain it, Keanu admitted. I still get caught up in small frustrations or ego stuff like everyone else. The difference now is that I notice it happening. He tapped his temple. There's a part of me that can step back and say, look at what you're doing right now. Is this really who you want to be? Mindfulness, Joe suggested. Something like that, Keanu agreed, though I wouldn't claim to be particularly good at it. It's more like an ongoing practice, a daily choice to try to stay awake rather than sleepwalking through life. Do you have specific practices that help? Meditation or anything like that? Keanu considered this. Not formal meditation, though. I respect those who do it. For me, it's more about finding moments throughout the day to check in with myself. Am I present right now? Or am I lost in thoughts about the past or worries about the future? He gestured to the studio around them. Like right now, this conversation, I could be thinking about how it's going to be received or what projects I should mention to promote, or a dozen other things outside this moment. Or I can choose to be fully here, having this exchange with you, right now. Joe nodded, understanding, completely. That's what makes conversations like this so rare. Most people aren't fully present even when they're sitting right in front of you. It's human nature, Keanu said. Our minds are always pulling us away from the present, planning, remembering, worrying. And modern life makes it worse. We're constantly bombarded with distractions. So how do you combat that? Joe pressed. In practical terms? Simple things, Keanu said. When I eat, I try to just eat, to really taste the food, to be grateful for it. When I ride my motorcycle, I focus completely on the road, the machine, the sensations. When I'm with friends, I put the phone away and actually listen. He shrugged slightly. I fail at this all the time, but I keep trying, and I've found that the more I practice being present in ordinary moments, the easier it is to stay grounded. During the extraordinary ones, both good and bad, Joe sat back taking this in. That makes a lot of sense. It's like training a muscle. Exactly, Keanu said, pointing again for emphasis. You don't get physically strong by lifting weights once. You do it consistently over time. Being present works the same way. As Keanu spoke, Joe was struck by the contrast between the man sitting across from him and the action hero many people knew from the screen. There was a gentleness to Keanu, a thoughtfulness that rarely came through in interviews but seemed to be at the core of who he was. You know, Joe said, I think that's what people respond to in your work. Beyond the stunts and the action sequences, there's an authenticity that comes through. Keanu looked slightly uncomfortable with the praise. I just try to bring something real to each role, whatever that might be. That's rarer than you might think, Joe said. A lot of people in entertainment are so focused on being liked that they never reveal anything true about themselves on screen or off. Fear, Keanu suggested. Fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood. It's easier to hide behind a carefully managed image. But you've managed to avoid that trap, Joe observed. Despite being in the public eye for what, almost 40 years. Now? Keanu smiled slightly. I've made my share of mistakes, said things I regret, handled situations poorly. But I've tried to learn from those moments rather than becoming more guarded. He leaned forward slightly. There's freedom in accepting your own imperfection. Once you stop trying to appear flawless, you can actually be real with people. As he spoke these words, something clicked into place for Joe. An understanding of why this conversation felt so different from the hundreds of celebrity interviews he'd conducted over the years. There was no performative aspect to Keanu's responses, no calculated attempt to manage his image. Just honest reflection from a person who had lived an extraordinary life and was still making sense of it. I think that's what wisdom actually is, Joe said thoughtfully. Not having all the answers, but being comfortable with the questions. Being willing to stay open despite knowing how painful life can be. Keanu nodded slowly. Maybe so. He glanced at his watch, then back at Joe. Should we continue or? Let's keep going, Joe said without hesitation. This is too good to cut short. The studio was quiet as the recording light finally switched off after nearly 6 hours of conversation. Joe sat still in his chair, hands resting on his knees, looking slightly dazed. Across from him, Keanu rolled his shoulders, releasing the tension that had built up from sitting for so long. Neither man spoke immediately, as if reluctant to break the spell of what had just transpired between them. Jamie was the first to move, sliding off his headphones and approaching with water bottles for both men. His expression was unlike anything Joe had seen before, a mixture of respect and something deeper, almost reverence. That was, Jamie began, then shook his head, at a loss for words. Yeah, Joe agreed quietly. It was. Keanu accepted the water with a nod of thanks. Hope it wasn't too much of a ramble, he said, the characteristic humility returning now that they were off air. Joe almost laughed. Are you kidding? That was one of the most meaningful conversations I've ever had on this show. Maybe the most meaningful. The small crew that had been so still and attentive during the recording now moved around the studio, busying themselves with equipment, but Joe noticed how they kept glancing over, clearly still processing what they had witnessed. You want to grab some food? Joe asked Keanu. There's a great little place just down the street. No fuss, very private. Keanu checked his watch. I should probably head out, actually. Early call time tomorrow. He smiled. But rain check? Next time I'm in town? Absolutely. Joe stood feeling strangely emotional as the reality set in that the conversation was truly ending. It had become so immersive that emerging from it felt like surfacing from underwater, disorienting, a shift into a different reality. As they walked toward the exit, Joe's phone buzzed with notifications. He glanced at it briefly, then turned it face down. Whatever was happening in the digital world could wait. Your bike's still out front, he told Keanu. We made sure security kept an eye on it. Thanks, Keanu said. Appreciate that. They paused at the door and Keanu extended his hand. Joe took it, then pulled him into a brief hug instead. Thank you, Joe said simply. For being real. For saying things that matter. Keanu nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. Thank you for creating the space for it. And then he was gone, helmet in hand, walking toward his motorcycle in the fading afternoon light. Joe stood in the doorway watching as Keanu started the bike and pulled away, a strange mixture of emotions washing over him. He felt both drained and energized, as if he had experienced something profound that would take days or even weeks to fully process. Boss? Jamie appeared at his side. You okay? Joe turned, noticing the same look in Jamie's eyes that he felt in himself. Yeah. Just taking it in. That was something else, Jamie said quietly. In all the years we've been doing this, I've never heard anything like that last hour. Joe nodded. Me neither. Back inside, the crew was wrapping up, shutting down equipment and preparing to leave. Joe sank back into his chair, mind still swimming with the conversation. Not just Keanu's words, but the feeling they had created. There had been moments of such honest vulnerability that the usual barriers between people had seemed to dissolve completely. "What's the plan for releasing this one?" Jamie asked, already thinking ahead to the practical aspects of their work. Joe considered this. Typically, they released episodes within a few days of recording. But this felt different, more significant. Somehow, it deserved special consideration. "Let's sit on it for a week," he decided. "I want to listen to the whole thing again before we put it out. Make sure we get it right." Jamie nodded, understanding. "I'll start the editing process tomorrow. Any particular direction you want to go with it?" "Minimal cuts," Joe said immediately. "Leave the pauses, the thinking moments. None of that needs to be polished away. It's part of what made it real." "Got it." Jamie hesitated. "You think people will get it? What happened in here today?" It was a fair question. In a world of sound, bites and viral clips designed for maximum engagement, a 6-hour philosophical conversation about meaning and connection might seem out of place. But Joe had faith in their audience. "The right people will get it," he said. "This one isn't for everyone, but for the people who need to hear it, really need it, it'll find them." The drive home that evening felt different from his usual post-recording routine. Usually, Joe's mind would be buzzing with follow-up questions he wished he'd asked or points he could have explored further. But tonight, there was a strange sense of completion. The conversation had found its own perfect rhythm and depth, unfolding exactly as it needed to. At home, Joe declined dinner, not hungry, despite the long day. Instead, he poured a small glass of whiskey and sat on his back porch, watching the sunset. His phone continued to buzz with notifications, but he left it inside. Whatever the world wanted from him could wait until tomorrow. What Keanu had said about presence kept returning to him, about the choice to be fully in each moment, rather than constantly somewhere else mentally. And here now, watching the sky transform from blue to orange to deep purple, Joe made that choice consciously. Just this moment, just this breath, just this experience, without needing to capture it or share it or analyze it. A week later, Joe sat in his home office, headphones on, listening to the final edit of the Keanu episode for the 3rd time. Jamie had done exactly as requested, preserving the natural flow of the conversation with minimal cuts. The result was unlike anything they had ever released before, more like a philosophical dialogue than a podcast interview. His phone rang, displaying Jamie's name. "Hey," Joe answered, "just finishing another listen through." "And?" Jamie asked. "We still good to release tomorrow morning?" "Definitely," Joe confirmed. "It's perfect. You did a great job with the edit." "I barely touched it," Jamie admitted. "It didn't need much. Listen, I'm calling because social media is already buzzing. Someone from the crew must have mentioned something about the recording because people are speculating like crazy about what Keanu said that broke you." Joe smiled slightly. "Let them speculate. It'll be out tomorrow anyway. You want me to post any kind of teaser? Build the anticipation?" Joe thought for a moment, then shook his head even though Jamie couldn't see him. "No, let it speak for itself. This one doesn't need hype." After hanging up, Joe went back to the recording, skipping to the heart of the conversation, the moment when Keanu had spoken about connection, kindness, and finding beauty, even in the painful parts of life. Hearing it again, days later, the tiny words still resonated deeply. The next morning, the episode went live at exactly 8 a.m. Joe deliberately stayed off social media, giving himself space to let the conversation exist in the world without immediately tracking reactions or metrics. Instead, he went for a long hike in the hills behind his house, practicing presence just as Keanu had described. It was late afternoon when he finally checked his phone. What he found stunned him. The episode had exploded online in a way none of them had anticipated. Not with controversy or sensationalism, but with gratitude. His inbox was flooded with messages from listeners describing how deeply the conversation had affected them. "Just listen to your conversation with Keanu." One message read, "I've been struggling with some heavy stuff lately, feeling lost. Something about what he said about finding meaning in connection with others. It was exactly what I needed to hear right now. Thank you both for being so real." Message after message echoed the same sentiment. People finding unexpected comfort and clarity in the philosophical exchange between two men trying to make sense of life's complexity. By evening, clips from the episode had gone viral, particularly the segment where Keanu spoke about loss and disorientation, giving way to a deeper understanding of what matters. News sites were running stories with headlines like, "Keanu Reeves profound. Thoughts on life and loss leave Joe Rogan speechless." Jamie called again, excitement evident in his voice. "Boss, this is insane. We've never had numbers like this." And the comments. People are actually having meaningful discussions in the comments section. "When does that ever happen?" Joe smiled. "Send me the best clips people are sharing. I want to see what's resonating most." As he watched the segments that were going viral, Joe noticed something interesting. It wasn't just Keanu's wisdom that people were responding to, but the authentic exchange between them. The moments of shared understanding, the pauses for reflection, the vulnerability on both sides. In a media landscape often dominated by performance and posturing, the genuine connection had stood out like a beacon. 3 days after the release, Joe received a text from a number he didn't recognize. "It's Keanu," it read. "Wanted to say thanks for the conversation and for how you presented it. Seems like it's connecting with people in a way neither of us expected. That's a gift." Joe stared at the message for a long moment before replying, "Thank you for being willing to go there. For being real when it would have been easier to stay on the surface. It mattered to people. It mattered to me." In the weeks that followed, Joe found himself referencing the conversation in other interviews, not as a name drop or to boost his own profile, but because the insights Keanu had shared had genuinely shifted something in his approach to both his work and his life. "I had a conversation recently that changed how I think about a lot of things," he would say. "It reminded me that beneath all the noise and distraction, what we're really looking for is connection, moments of genuine understanding between people." And in his own life, Joe began to notice the small moments more, the brief exchanges with strangers, the quiet conversations with friends, the times when pretense fell away and something authentic emerged. Not because these moments were new, but because he was finally paying attention to what had been there all along. In a world constantly pulling toward the superficial, for a few hours in a small studio in Los Angeles, two men had chosen to dive deeper. And in doing so, they had created something that continued to ripple outward, touching lives they would never know, reminding people that even in the digital age, what matters most remains stubbornly, beautifully human.